and thank you to Dr. Barboot for giving me the opportunity to give my talk. I always at the beginning have to say the triple dog and say that we're better at football than y'all. Sorry. It's obligatory. So today, originally my old major professor and now my coworker, Dr. Jeff Buer, was asked to give this talk on feather retention force and rigor, but unfortunately he couldn't make it today. So he asked me instead to give this presentation, and we worked on it together. And like Dr. Brasa said, I've been working with their group a long time. This was actually my very first poster as an undergraduate, and it was on some of the same research. So it's a nice full circle of starting as an undergrad and then getting to present some of the same work as now a scientist. So like we mentioned, I'm going to be talking about rigor mortis and feather retention force. When you think about feather retention force, it may seem fairly easy, just pulling out feathers. How hard is that? But it's actually very complicated, and there's a lot of different factors. So this is just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to first start talking about muscles and the different types, how rigor mortis is different in those striated or smooth muscles. We're going to talk a little bit about the feather follicle anatomy, and then talk about how you take those feather force measurements and then some of the factors that can impact it. So I am not a physiologist, so we're not going to go too deep into the anatomy of this, but I just want to talk about the difference. Okay. I just want to talk about the difference between your skeletal muscle and then your smooth muscle. So this is skeletal muscle. It's called striated because it has, it looks striated. It has those lines, the Z discs. When contractions occur, the Z discs come closer together, and then the diameter of those sarcomeres gets larger. This is quite a bit different than smooth muscle because it's not striated. So you do have the actin and myosin, and they do pull on the sarcolemmas, and it generates tension, but just in a different way. There's two different types of smooth muscle. There's multi-unit and then single unit. Single unit is the muscle works as a single unit. That's like your visceral, that's what actually lines your urinary tract. Dr. Buer wanted me to make a joke about how that's how all of our seats are dry this morning, is that we have that smooth muscle working. He said that, not me. But then we have our multi-unit, which as it sounds, it works in different units. It actually has connections to neurons and to the central nervous system. And some of those muscles are like your iris. That is a type of multi-unit smooth muscle. Also, your hair follicles. So whenever you get goosebumps, that's actually that smooth muscle working. So we had a hard time finding if that smooth muscle was the same as the hair follicles versus the feather follicles. There wasn't much research on that, but I think we can assume that it's probably very similar. So now jumping into rigor mortis. So that is the stiffening of death that occurs post-mortem. It occurs in all types of muscles, skeletal, smooth, cardiac. And I'm not going to read this all out to you. This is some of what is happening physiological-wise with the different striated versus smooth muscle. But I just want to focus on that it has 4 different stages. You have a delay, onset, completion, and then a resolution of rigor. And so onset occurs when the oxygen stops being delivered to that muscle, and you switch from aerobic metabolism to anaerobic metabolism. And then completion is when you have no more ATP. So ATP is what uncouples that actin-myosin bond. And so when you don't have any more ATP, those bonds stay. And then resolution occurs when some of that structure of the myofibrils starts to degrade. And you get that tenderness back. And we can't talk about rigor without talking about pH. There's a obvious connection between the two. So during that initial phase, you have the muscle pH is still around neutral. When you start having that release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you start getting lactic acid accumulation from the anaerobic metabolism, the pH decreases. And so rigor onset occurs at approximately 6.2 pH. And then you also get, when it's at full rigor, the pH ends up being around 6. And this occurs in poultry around 2 to 4 hours postmortem. We'll just say an average of 3 hours. And then just briefly talking about resolution, the resolution of rigor is actually a lot faster in poultry than other animals. So this is species, and then you have days to reach 80% maximum tenderness. And you can see down here, chicken is only approximately 8 hours. Awesome. So now I'm going to jump to feather retention force, the more exciting part in my opinion. So the feather retention force, that is just the max load it takes to remove that feather calamus. That's like the quill of the, like when you have a feather pen, it's the quill from the feather follicle. Larger feathers require greater force. And there's multiple different factors that can impact the force. So the way you pull out the feather can impact the force, the environmental temperature, which can affect like the surface temperature of the carcasses. And then I'm also going to just briefly highlight stunning. Just to say, stunning has no impact. So we're going to go ahead and get that out of the way. So Dr. Buer and then Dr. Krupala have also looked at feather retention forces and the difference between gas stunning and electrical stunning, and there's no significant differences. Awesome. Okay. So now let's just go into the feather microanatomy, the follicles. So I just wanted to focus on these underlined areas, and then I highlighted them in the red circles. So as you can see, we have different layers of smooth muscle, 7, 8, and 9, and then we have our striated subcutaneous muscles. So those are under here. And so the interesting thing is that muscles 9 and then 13 and 14 are actually what moves the feathers flat against the body for flight, and so they're a little bit stronger. And as you can see, here is the muscle lining, and then here is the feather follicle. And as you can see, the muscles are connected to the feather follicles, not the feathers themselves. This is just showing it another way through histology. You can see the muscles and then the tendons. Here is that feather in the feather follicle, and you can see that space in between the feather and then the muscle. Again, we just have more different pictures. So something that used to be kind of a thought was that that during rigor, the feathers would set, or there'd be issues where something happens and the feathers would set in the follicles. And that's not really the case, as you can see, because you do have that gap between the feather and the muscle itself. So it's not the muscle connected to the feather, it's connected to the follicle. And the interesting thing too, so a lot of these are histology slides. So during the histology process, it actually increases that gap between the feather follicle and then the feather itself, and that's kind of similar to what you would see with scalding. Again, so one more, just feather follicle, you can see the muscle, and then this is the connection between the calamus and then the follicle. So how do we measure feather retention force? So the method hasn't actually really changed that much since 2000. So we have a hemostat connected to our force gauge. Back in 2000, they just used an analog force gauge. Now we're just using digital. So make sure you charge your gauges beforehand is what we've learned many times. And we always go, when we're looking at feathers, especially on the wings, we want to go for those secondary feathers versus primary feathers. There's a lot more variation in those primary feathers. And so we prefer to get those secondary feathers that are right there. And then you can see this picture shows where we are using the hemostat to grab that feather. We're clamping down on where the feather exits the follicle. Let's see, I think I have a better photo next. So we're grabbing this area where it is, where it's exiting the follicle, and we want to make sure that we're getting mature feathers, not immature feathers, because that can also impact the force. when we're doing experiments and we're measuring feather retention force, we always go for, we usually try to do 6 feather pulls. We're aiming for 5. Sometimes you'll have an uh-oh where the gauge or the hemostat doesn't clamp onto the feather properly. And so we always like to do at least 6 feathers. That way we can get a good 5. And we always go in a row. That's just because if you're doing it just by random, you might grab a bigger feather just if you're doing it by eyeball versus if you're going in a row, you're being consistent. This is similar to the tail feathers. I apologize for the beautiful shot, but I wanted to show which feathers we grab from the tail. And again, we do 6 feathers in a row. That way we're not doing any skewing. And then this is just a picture of the feathers we pull out. And then I just did a little example. That's how this rubber chicken, the feather force was about 2 grams. So I had fun doing some photo shoots earlier this week. So next I'm going to jump into a couple different experiments where we've used feather retention force. So this was done back when I was an undergrad. But we were looking, this was some of the beginning work that we did on looking at delayed processing. So the thought process of slaughtering on farm, transporting the carcasses to the plant where they'll then be scalded and then picked. And so this is some of that just initial work that we did looking at if this would be doable and how it would affect picking. So we measured feather retention force pre and post scald. So we had different treatments where we sampled at 0, and then we had delay treatments where we delayed 1, 2, 4, or 8 hours post-slaughter before we scalded and picked. We did 5 different carcasses per treatment, and then we did the wing and tail feathers. And then again, we just alternated pulling left to right, right to left, just so we didn't skew any of our data by randomly picking feathers. So setting up this figure, we have our feather retention force on the y-axis, and then the bird number, that's just our birds the number of birds that we did in total. And then on the, over here, we have the hollow points are the ones that are pre-scald, the filled in shapes are the post-scald. And this is for our wing feathers. So as you can see, there's a pretty big difference between our pre-scalded and our post-scalded for the feather retention force of your wing feathers. And then I also included the red arrow here of when you would estimate a rigor onset at 3 hours. When we look at the tail feathers, there's actually not nearly as much of a difference between the force pre and post scald. So you see a little bit where most of the pre-scalded ones are on the top, post-scalded are on the bottom, but that difference is a lot closer than it was for the wing feathers. And so, like I mentioned, scalding did significantly decrease feather retention force, both for, mostly for wing feathers, tail feathers, again, not as big of a difference. Why does this happen? This is because around the wing, the skin is a lot thinner. And so it's a lot easier to pull out those feathers than at the tail where that skin is a lot thicker. That's why in plants they use quill pullers. Yeah, whenever we process birds in like our pilot plants, whenever they come out the picker or when they come out of the scalder, we will usually hand pick those tail feathers just because we know that they're not going to come out by themselves. And we don't want to pull in the picker too tight and mess up the carcass quality. So I just wanted to show some pictures from this experiment. So this is our control group, 0 hours between bleeding and then scalding and picking. The birds look pretty good. Not many feathers, hanging on a little bit at the head, a little bit on the shanks, but not bad. 2 hours is fairly similar. We got a little bit more feathering around this area versus prior, the 0 hour control. When we saw a big difference was the 4 hour. A lot big difference, especially around the wing area. Again, the shank area, and then around the legs was very different quality, and there's a lot of feathers. This was because they were in rigor. We did measure breast muscle pH for these, and so this is the pH times 0, 1, 2, 4, and 8. And as you can see at the 2-hour treatment, that's when the pH indicates that the birds were in rigor. This is a little bit sooner than what we would anticipate normally, but we think this is because of the higher body temperature of the carcasses. They weren't beginning to be chilled and all that stuff. So we think that just because of the higher body temperature, we had a faster onset of glycogen depletion, resulting in that lower pH faster. And this is a video. I want to thank Alec and all the GTR Guide group because they took this video from me and let me borrow it. So this is actually at our UGA pilot plant, and as you can see, this is a control bird going through the picker, and you can see there's a lot of movement, a lot of flexibility. This is what we would hope for, and that's what allows for the good defeathering, is that twisting of the carcass during picking. And so you can see it. As soon as it starts twisting, you can really see the feathers literally flying off. And then we didn't have any of the pictures of our delayed processing ones. We did some in a commercial plant, and then we would have had to get their approval to use them. So I just wanted to include this one. All right, so this leads into our next experiment that we did, looking at the holding temperature post-mortem. So we were curious, okay, if we do delayed processing and the carcasses are being transported, how does that environmental temperature impact feathering? So if it's in a colder climate versus a hotter climate, what's the difference? So we again measured retention force, or feather retention force, pre-scald and post-scald. We did 4 and 8 hours post-slaughter, and then we held them at a cold temperature, room temperature, and then a warmer temperature. And again, we did 5 carcasses. We sampled 6 feathers, both wing and tail. So just doing a little summary of this project. When we had them in the cold environment, they were extremely hard to pick. We had significant increases in feather retention force versus when we had them at that hotter temperature. It was almost like a pre-scald. The feathers, when you were pulling them off, even before the scalder, it felt like we had put them through the scalder already. And we think that's just because of the skin temperature. And I think this is something that would be a really interesting research project in the future, even with just traditional processing, on how those temperatures prior to processing affect feather retention force. And I feel like that could play a big impact on how you set your scalders and pickers. Again, this is just more summary. You have more of the tissue contraction when the environment was colder versus when we had that really warm temperature. Again, it felt like they had already been scalded. And so the environmental temperature really had a significant impact. So now I'm just going to talk about some of the factors that can impact feather retention force. So we're going to first talk about scalding and how that plays into how easy it is for the feathers to be removed. So we have our traditional hard versus soft scalding parameters, where you have the higher temperature hard scalding versus the soft scalding, which is at a lower temperature. And how does this impact feather retention force? If you're just thinking about it, not really having much information, you would think, oh, well, lower temperature, feathers are going to be harder to pick. It's kind of what you would think, but the important part is immersion time, we have found. So the birds will pick just the same, the feather retention force will be just the same, as long as you have them in the scalders for the correct amount of time. So you want to have hard scald shorter time, soft scald a little bit longer. And we found out, kind of unfortunately, in a recent experiment when our boiler wasn't working, that you can heat scalder tanks with hot water pressure washers, and it works. And we actually over-scalded some birds, which was kind of impressive, even though we were struggling. We were having to improvise. And so finally, I just want to focus on some of what our facilities are at our U.S. National Poultry Research Center and what we do in our pilot plant. So This was our previous picker that we've been using for as long as I've been there. I'm not sure how long it's been in the building, but we had this Stork D8 picker. I think the Morel people told us that this was the last one that they sold back in the day. So I think it is the same one that they have at the UGA pilot plant. It has 4 different banks of picker fingers, as you can see here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the thing that we've had issues with is all the banks are connected. So when you try to adjust, like you have to adjust all of the banks, not just one individually. So thankfully in the last, it's been about a 2-year effort for Dr. Buer, a lot of paperwork, but we got delivered a new Morel picker, and this was it on the truck when it was delivered. I was very stressed out when they were getting it off the forklift. You getting it off the truck with the forklift. But we have a much better picker now. So it has 6 banks, so it has 3 banks on each side. And the amazing part is that each bank can be adjusted individually. So if we're trying to adjust, like at the shanks, we don't have to adjust everything. We can just adjust those 2 top banks. And this is actually a standard commercial picker. They just have 4 or 5 of these versus the one that we have. And then this is just a picture. We're still in the process of getting it up and running. It has water in it. We can move the line through it, but the electrical is still not plugged up. So as you can see, this is just pictures of how we would adjust the height, the gap, the angle of all the different banks of picker fingers. And as you can see them here. And then again, that's just the same. That's what we use to adjust them. And we're very excited because this will give us, with our pilot plant, a lot better picking quality, because as the birds have gotten a lot bigger, we've had issues with being able to pick our birds with this older equipment. We've done test runs. They pick really well if we run them through twice, but we have to wait for the shackle line to go all the way around, and it's kind of inconvenient. So hopefully with this new picker, we won't have to worry about our picking quality as much. We're also curious, hopefully, once we get it up and running, using different picker finger lengths. So kind of jerry-rigging, like you have multiple pickers with different picker lengths. Well, what if we have one picker with different picker lengths so that we can have it like as an attack and a finisher picker? This point that Dr. Buer had on here, this was before we had our new fancy picker. So when we were having issues, we have some of those little drum pickers, and we were like, okay, well, can we use that as a finisher picker after they come out of our normal picker? And then lastly, we're also in the process of looking at getting different shackle types. It's kind of a issue where they're either too short or too long when we've gotten them from the company. So we're gonna look into getting some fabricated for us. So finally, just in summary, carcass rigger onset impacts feather retention force due to that carcass flexibility being lost. So the carcass rigor is accelerated by those clonic-tonic convulsions. Again, we didn't find any difference in stunning and how the 2 stunning methods impact feather retention force. Cervical dislocation can impact how fast the carcass is going to rigor. Electrical stimulation, which has become a lot more used in the plants, can also impact the length of time that it takes for rigor to occur. And then again, what we found was environmental temperatures and carcass temperatures really do impact feather retention force. So how do we solve this problem? Dr. Buer did a long time ago a lot of work on featherless broilers, so let's just have featherless broilers and not have to even worry about picking. No. I thankfully wasn't around during this time, but they scratched each other. It did not work out. There's a reason why we don't do it. So I'm going to thank you to everybody. I want to acknowledge Dr. Barassa for her work when she was at USDA helping with this project. Kim Wilson, she was doing her master's during the same time I was an undergrad. She now has her PhD and works for Hill's Pet Nutrition. And then I also included, hopefully it works, a QR code for my references. If you take a picture, hopefully a PDF pops up if you're curious, just some of the references I used. But thank y'all so much for listening, and I'll take any questions if we have time.